What are the top 5 books you should read on the topic of ethics? I invited on a philosopher who's an expert when it comes to ethics. My guest is Dr. Dustin Crummett. Let's get started.
Ethics is basically the branch of philosophy that deals with practical issues. What actions are right or wrong, what things are good or bad, what is it to be a good person, what sorts of things are virtues. That's what ethics is, and so ethicists attempt to answer those questions, figure out how you ought to live by employing philosophical reasoning. Maybe another thing to say, ethics is often divided into 3 branches. So there's metaethics, which deals with meta questions about, say, whether moral truths are objective or not, whether there are moral truths at all. Normative ethics, or ethical theory, which attempts to figure out what is it that makes right acts right, wrong acts wrong, that sort of stuff. And applied ethics, which deals with specific individual ethical questions. Gun control, abortion, taxation, all those sorts of things. I have 5 pretty introductory books, and then if you would like, I can provide some further, more difficult readings for people who want to go further. So there's a book that I co-authored with Rebecca Chan, Liz Jackson, who I think has been on the show, and Tyrant Goldschmidt, called Applied Ethics: An Impartial Introduction. So that covers a range of different issues in applied ethics. The subtitle, An Impartial Introduction, is because we try to fairly provide discussion of multiple sides of these issues. So there are chapters about abortion, about animal rights, about charitable giving, about disability, criminal justice, environmental ethics. So that's my first recommendation. A second recommendation is a book. This is also mostly applied ethics, called Ethics Left and Right. So this was edited by Bob Fisher. I wrote 1 chapter out of several dozen chapters in it. There's material at the beginning that discusses ethical theory and maybe also some stuff in metaethics, but the significant bulk of the book consists of essays written by philosophers, basically discussing contemporary ethical and political issues through the lens of philosophy and ethics. And each one, there are 2 opposing, like each issue, there are 2 opposing authors who debate each other. And so that gives a good and I think balanced overview. You can get both sides of on a wide range of issues. I wrote part of the first chapter. So the first chapter is about what kind of political philosophy underlies left and right wing thought. So setting the stage for discussions of all the other political issues, right? So I wrote the left wing half of that chapter, arguing that a lot of modern left-wing thought can be explained through the lens of what's called social egalitarianism. And my interlocutor was Chad McIntosh, so he wrote the right-wing half of the chapter. A third book is Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. So he's a very controversial thinker because he's defended some, in some cases, quite awful views about infanticide and disability and so forth. But I think that the book, and first of all, it's very readable. It's accessible to someone without a big philosophical background. And I think it's well worth reading, partly because he also, I think, gets some issues importantly right, where everybody else had been getting them wrong. Some of his writings about factory farming, say, or about charitable giving, I'm quite sympathetic to. But also, I mean, really what he's trying to do is work out all of the implications of utilitarianism, more or less, for your life. And it's worthwhile intellectually to see someone engaged in that project, to see okay, these are the implications of this version of utilitarianism that he defends. And think about, when you think he gets the wrong answers, think about, okay, where do I think he went wrong, right? And what does that tell me about ethical? So I certainly don't agree with everything that he says, but it is, I think, an interesting book for somebody trying to get into ethics to engage with. My fourth recommendation is called Contractualism. It's in the Cambridge Elements series. Unfortunately, I'm not going to try to pronounce the guy's name because I think I don't know how to pronounce the author's name. So it's safer not to. But people who Google Cambridge Elements Contractualism will find the book. So utilitarianism is a paradigm consequentialist theory. So consequentialists think that morality is all about doing what will produce the best consequences, right? And utilitarians evaluate consequences by appeal to utility, which is well-being or happiness or something, right? There are other schools of ethical thought. So the traditional division is consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. Virtue ethics says that ethics fundamentally is about behaving virtuously, being a good person. Deontology is a little harder to define, but it rejects consequentialism at least. It says that sometimes you have duties to do things that maybe aren't the best overall, but you have them for some other reason. Maybe some actions, there's some reason not to perform them just because the action is bad, or maybe you have special obligations to people around you that aren't just obligations to improve the value of the world or something. Contractualism is one of the leading deontological theories, as one that I'm inclined to think captures at least an important part of morality. And this book provides a pretty accessible overview of contractualist thought. If people have watched the show The Good Place, the book What We Owe to Each Other plays a big role in that. And contractualism basically winds up being like the canonical ethical theory in The Good Place. It's thinking of morality as somehow being modeled by a contract, not an actual contract, right? I never signed any contract. But the thought is, what is like the basic point of behaving morally? And contractualists say it's something to do with the kinds of relationships that you stand in with other beings when you behave morally. Right? What behaving morally allows you to do is exist on terms of mutual respect, decency, whatever with others. It allows you to live in such a way that others have no legitimate complaint against you, right? And so, and when we talk about a legitimate complaint, I mean, people could complain when they don't have any good reason to complain, right? Or somebody might not complain when they do have good reason to complain. Maybe you brainwash them or something, right? So when we say morality, it's something to do with like living in such a way that nobody has a reasonable objection to how you live. The reasonable part is important, right? So we think about, okay, what would we decide on if we were trying to decide on principles that would govern our behavior towards one another? And we were in a position where we were all fully informed. We were all negotiating in good faith, trying to figure out if there's some set of principles that would be good for me, but they would be worse for you, then I'm willing to compromise, etc. So people who are reasonable, well-informed, operating in good faith, etc., what sort of principles would they decide on to govern their relations with one another? What are principles to which, at the end of the negotiation, nobody would have a reasonable objection to? The contractualist thinks the outcome of this imaginary process, like that is a way we can model the moral principles. They're principles that like nobody has a reasonable objection to. And that explains why behaving in accordance with those principles allows you to live on terms of respect and decency with others. That contrasts with, say, I would say the biggest other strains of deontological thought. One is Kantianism. So Kant thought that morality was about treating others as ends in themselves and never as mere means, and also behaving only in ways that you could will to be universal principles, and also behaving as if your actions were legislating laws for people living in the kingdom of ends. And somehow he thought that those were all the same thing. So those are all supposed to be statements of the categorical imperative. And he thought that the categorical imperative is a law that you of necessity give to yourself. So for Kant, you could think of morality, the underlying justification for morality is that it's really like an expression of your own autonomous reason, because you have to legislate for yourself the categorical imperative. So when you behave morally, really you're only behaving in accordance with the principles that you already necessarily will to be ones that govern your behavior. Kantianism, I think, is not promising for reasons that if this was about Kantianism, I could talk about for a long time. Another big strain of deontological thought is what's sometimes called pluralism or intuitionism. This goes back to W.D. Ross in the 1930s. So pluralists think, look, there are just a number of different moral principles, and there's no grand unifying theory of how they all fit together. Yeah, you should do stuff that's good. You should keep your promises. You should be good to people who have been good to you. You should punish the wicked. There might be like a big list of principles, and the pluralist just says, look, as far as we can tell, that's all there is to say about it. There's just a big list of principles, and you have to weigh what happens if you can do more good by breaking your promise. you have to just think about it and use your own good judgment, right? There's no algorithm, there's no grand theory. So intuitionism has the virtue, if it's a virtue, of letting you, it's going to fit best with your pre-theoretic views about what you should do, right? Because you can always just say, well, okay. But it's maybe theoretically unsatisfactory because you just stop with a bunch of principles and you don't have any way to unify them. It's not a very simple theory. And so, yeah, that's how contractualism contrasts. My fifth recommendation, this is also in the Cambridge Elements series. It's a book called Parfit's Ethics by Richard Yetter Chappell. So Parfit was, to my mind, probably the most important ethicist in the analytic philosophical tradition. He made major contributions in a number of areas, and he also basically invented entire areas of ethics and modern population ethics, modern discussions of personal ontology, a problem called the non-identity problem, and all the stuff that flows from that. All of that basically comes from Parfit's writing. And in fact, all of that comes from a single book that Parfit wrote called Reasons and Persons in 1984. And he was really an impressive guy because almost all of these are things that like really anybody could have, the insights that he had are things that like anybody could have had at any point, right? It's not like the fine tuning argument where nobody could come up with this argument until something had happened in science or something. But just for thousands of years, nobody had these insights until Parfit did. And so he was an impressive guy who made, as I say, very important contributions to a number of areas in ethics. And this book, I think Richard Yetter Chappell was a student of Parfit's, and it goes over his thought in a number of areas. And in doing that, you also get some exposure to the discussions going on in these different areas.
On average, we spend about 1/3 of our lives at work. That's a huge chunk of your life. So you should choose a career that is meaningful and impactful, especially if you're a Christian. We're called to be good stewards of the talents and time that God has given us. So which careers should you consider? How about the ones that are aimed at solving some of the world's most pressing problems? And if you make one of those careers your goal, what specific steps do you need to take to get there? These questions can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing if you're trying to figure all of this out alone. But you don't have to. There's a program that can help. Christians for Impact is a charity designed to help Christians with career discernment. They have over 50 experienced mentors who will pray with you one-on-one, help you map out a career plan, and connect you with hundreds of Christian professionals. You might be thinking, this sounds awesome, but how much does it cost? Well, this is the most amazing part. This mentorship program is completely free. How does it work? Just spend 10 minutes reading the career guide linked in the description below. At the end of that career guide, you'll see a link to apply for a free one-on-one mentorship. After submitting your application, you'll hear a response within 1 to 2 weeks, connecting you with a career mentor. If you're a committed Christian based in the US or the UK, especially if you're between the ages of 18 and 25, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss. So check out the career guide linked in the description below and apply today. While you're there, check out the Christians for Impact newsletter and podcast. Both will provide you with even more resources to help you start navigating your career journey today.
Let's take it to the next level. So basically the way that I learned ethics was I read a book called the Oxford Handbook of Ethical Theory, which I still think is quite good. It's an edited volume that has chapters about a bunch of different ethical theories and that sort of stuff. So it's more difficult than the books that I just recommended, or at least a lot of the essays are. But once you feel like you have a little facility with this stuff, I think it's a good resource for getting more detailed statements of some things. Parfit wrote 2 books in his life. They were called Reasons and Persons and On What Matters. And On What Matters had, I think, 3 volumes. So if you're interested in Parfit stuff, you could look into those. Reasons and Persons is the more important one. Peter Singer, for utilitarianism, Peter Singer wrote a book with a Polish philosopher named Katarina de Lazari-Radek. I hope I'm saying her name right, but called The Point of View of the Universe. And that's a good statement of modern consequentialist thought. Going back to the philosopher Sidgwick, who uses the phrase, the point of view of the universe, he's thinking the point of utilitarianism is to act from the point of view of the universe in this way that's partially defensible. The most prominent modern Kantian is Christine Korsgaard. She has a book, I think these were originally lectures, called The Sources of Normativity, where she lays out her own version of Kantianism. I also mentioned the book What We Owe to Each Other by T.M. Scanlon. That's the most important contemporary contractualist book. I haven't said anything about virtue ethics yet, and that reflects my own background and interests and stuff. But there's a book by Alistair MacIntyre called After Virtue, which often is credited, along maybe with an essay called Modern Moral Philosophy by Elizabeth Anscombe. After Virtue is credited with kind of stoking contemporary interest in virtue ethics. There's also Rosalind Hirschhaus has a book about virtue ethics, the name of which I forget. People who are interested in divine command theory should read Finite and Infinite Goods, Robert Adams. That's the most important contemporary statement of divine command theory. One point to make is that divine command theory is a thesis in metaethics. It's a thesis about like the nature of moral obligation. It says that moral obligations are divine commands or something. And then there's a further question about how that relates to the stuff I've been talking about with regard to ethical theory, right? Because in principle, you could be a divine command theorist and a contractualist or a Kantian or a consequentialist or whatever, right? You might think obligations are divine commands, and what God has commanded us to do is treat each other as ends in ourselves or whatever. So it's also important to note, even if you're a divine command theorist, that doesn't mean that automatically solves everything else in ethics, right? You still might want to be interested in fleshing out the divine commands, partly through the use of scripture or whatever, but also through natural reason, I think. And then I had just a couple things on topics in applied ethics. So I'm quite interested in effective altruism, and that's one of the biggest practical effects that analytic ethics has had, is giving rise to the effective altruist movement. I think you've done some videos for and against on your channel, Jordan. And I also have on mine. People might check out a book called Doing Good Better by Will MacAskill, which has been influential in modern discussions of these things. Abortion is an important topic for a lot of people. I think the best pro-life book is probably a book called The Ethics of Abortion by Chris Kazor. And the best pro-choice book is probably a book called The Ethics of Killing by Jeff McMahon. So if people are interested in that, they could read those books in tandem. I've also done work on animal welfare, animal rights, animal ethics, that sort of stuff. Two books that might be worth reading there. One is Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, which is, again, the more consequentialist, utilitarian approach. There's also a book called Fellow Creatures by Christine Korsgaard, who's a Kantian, giving a more deontological approach. So you, again, get different perspectives there. And then what I wrote my dissertation on was distributive justice, and there's a good book also by T.M. Scanlon called Why Does Inequality Matter?, which deals with some of those issues. Applied ethics is interesting in that applied ethicists write about everything, right? I mean, any ethical issue can be a topic in applied ethics. I threw in recommendations about those topics because those are topics that I have been interested in and have written on and so forth. But of course, you could with just as much justification provide readings for 24 other different topics, right? And so a lot of stuff whatever people are interested in terms of specific ethical issues, there's a good chance that philosophers have read stuff about it. But people can just start with the 5 that I said at first.